They were close to the outskirts of the village. Enri heard the sounds of clanking metal from behind her as she ran. It was a rhythmic sound. She looked behind with a prayer in her heart. As expected, it was the worst-case scenario. A knight was chasing the Emmot sisters. Just a little further. Enri took a deep breath and forced herself to soldier on. She had no energy to waste on anything else. Her breathing was rapid, her heart beating hard enough that she felt it would burst, and her legs were shaking mightily. Soon enough, she would be completely exhausted, and she would collapse and not get up. If she were alone, perhaps she might have lost the strength to run and given up. However, she was holding her little sister's hand. It gave her the energy to run away. The truth was that the powerful desire to save her sister had kept Enri going until now. As she ran, she glanced behind again. The distance between herself and her pursuer had not changed. Even in armor, the man's speed had not decreased. This was the difference between a trained warrior and a village girl. Sweat ran down Enri's back as her body went cold. If this kept up, she would not be able to escape with her sister.
Let her go!
Those words echoed through her head.
Perhaps you could escape by yourself. Do you want to die here? It might be safer if you split up. Shut up! Shut up! Shut up!
Enri shouted at herself for those thoughts through her clenched teeth. She was the worst sister imaginable. Why was her little sister holding her tears back? It was because she believed in her big sister. She believed her big sister would save her. As she gripped the hand of her little sister, that hand which gave her the strength to flee and fight on, Enri steeled herself and hardened her resolve. She would never abandon her sister.
Ah!
Enri's young sister was as tired as Enri herself. Therefore she suddenly stumbled, yelped, and almost fell. The reason why the two of them had not fallen was because they were holding tightly onto each other's hands. However, Nemu's near fall caused Enri to fall to herself.
Faster!
Although she wanted to run on, her little sister was starting to cramp up, and she could not move fast. Enri wanted to pick up Nemu and run, but the sounds of metal drawing up beside her filled Enri with fear. The knight beside her held a blood-stained sword. In addition, his armor and helm were covered in traces of spattered blood. Enri pushed Nemu behind herself and glared angrily at the knight.
It's pointless to struggle.
There was no compassion in those words. Instead, there was only mockery. Those words implied that running would only end in death anyway. That anger in Enri's heart boiled over, and she thought, what was he saying? The knight raised his sword to Enri, who had stopped moving. However, just before he could swing it down on them,
Don't look down on me!
Enri forcefully punched the knight's metal helmet. That strike carried the anger that filled her and the desire to protect her little sister. She did not care that she was striking metal with her bare hand. She hit him with every ounce of her strength. There was the sound of something like bones cracking, and soon pain spread throughout Enri's body. The knight wobbled under the force of the mighty blow.
Hurry!
Right!
Enri bit back the pain and made to flee again. And suddenly, a line of scorching heat bloomed on her back.
Damn you!
The village girl punching the knight in the face had shamed him, hence his anger. He was swinging his sword wildly, having lost his cool. As a result, his first blow did not cause a mortal wound. However, that was the end of her luck. Enri was hurt, and the knight was filled with rage. The next blow would certainly take her life. Enri looked at the long sword raised high before her. Panic was written all over her face as she watched the malevolent gleaming of the terrible, swift sword, and she realized two things. The first was that her life would be over in a few seconds. The second was that an ordinary village girl like herself had no way of fighting that fate. The tip of the sword was stained with some of her blood. As her heart beat faster, the pain spread through her body, along with the scorching heat of her wound. The pain she had never felt before filled her with fear and made her want to throw up. Perhaps vomiting would clear the feeling of nausea that filled her. However, Enri was looking for a way to live, so she had no time to throw up. Although she wanted to abandon her struggle, There was a reason why Enri had not given up until now. That was the warmth pressed against her chest. Her younger sister. She had to let her sister live. That sole thought kept Enri from giving in. In contrast, the armored knight in front of her seemed to be mocking Enri's resolve. The raised sword swung down. Perhaps it was because all her energies were concentrated here, or because her brain was working overtime because she was on the verge of life and death. But Enri felt that time was passing very slowly, and she desperately tried to think of some way to save her little sister. However, she could not think of anything. All she could do was use her own body as a shield, letting the blade cleave deeply into herself, in the hope of buying time for her little sister to escape. As long as she had the strength, she would hang on tightly to the knight or the sword he stuck in her, holding on tight and not letting go until the flame of her life guttered out. If she could do that, she would gladly accept her fate. Enri smiled, as though she were a martyr. As a big sister, this was all she could do for Nemu. The thought made Enri smile. Could Nemu escape the hell that was Carne Village by herself? Even if she fled into the forest, she might run into patrols of soldiers. However, as long as she could survive, there was a possibility of escape. In order to give her little sister the chance to survive, Enri would bet her life. No, she would bet everything. That said, the idea of being hurt again frightened her, so she closed her eyes. In this world of darkness, she prepared herself for the pain that would come.
The answer, where is it now? To get out with my soul. It's like a nightmare that I'm living every morning. When I wake up, only bones are what remain. I'm in a panic, get out, hurry up. Oh, there are mysteries and the miseries. They don't rely on me and let it cross up in mine. As I wander my way right into hell, an invitation with no emotion. I dance 1, 2, 3 steps on the start stage.
Raise your flag, march on fight, reaching for this mask of mine. As a shiver cold as ice is crawling down my spine. War and swords, tears and blood, suddenly I start to laugh.
And I just can't seem to hold it back. The answer, just toss it out.
And right now, where's my soul, where's my heart? Put your faith in your will to survive.
Don't hesitate, go this way.
'Cause I don't know, I don't care, even if it doesn't turn to nightmare.
I'll just keep surviving from the darkness I'll emerge. And I'll keep running on my feet far as they will take me.
In this cold, miserable world.
Momonga sat on a chair and looked at the mirror before him. The roughly 1 meter wide mirror did not reflect Momonga's face. The mirror was like a television set, showing images of a distant plain. The grass of the plain swayed in the wind, proving it was not a still image. As time passed, the sun slowly rose, its light banishing the darkness that covered the plains. This pastoral scene, almost poetic in its beauty, was a stark difference from the former location of the great tomb of Nazarick, the desolate world of Helheim. Momonga reached out to the mirror and swiped his hand right. The mirror's image changed. This was a mirror of remote viewing. This was a magic item used to display an image of a specific region. It was a very useful item for player killers, or player killer killers. However, there were low-level spells which occluded information-gathering spells that could hide people from the mirror's eyes. In addition, it was easy for users to be counterattacked by offensive barriers, so it was an average item at best. However, for the present circumstances, an item which could show the outside world was a very useful item indeed. Momonga enjoyed the movie-like quality of the grass within the mirror as the image changed.
It would seem that I can move the image with a wave of the hand. That way, I won't have to keep looking at the same spot.
The scenery and the angles with which it was viewed changed within the floating mirror. Although he had made several mistakes so far, Momonga kept changing his gestures to alter the landscape within the mirror, hoping that he would find someone. However, up till now he had not found any intelligent beings, for instance, humans. He repeated the same simple gestures over and over again, but all the images he got were the same, planes. Momonga was starting to get bored, so he looked at the other person in the room. Sebas was the other person in the room. Although Sebas was absolutely loyal to him, he had objected to Momonga's excursion to the surface without bringing his followers along. Indeed, just after Momonga returned from the surface, Sebas had accosted and lectured him. Momonga said what was on his heart.
What will I do with him?
Being with Sebas made Momonga think of his guildmate Touchme. After all, Touchme was the one who had designed Sebas.
Still, he didn't have to make him so similar to himself. Even the way Sebas gets angry reminds me of him.
After grumbling in his heart, Momonga looked back to the mirror. Momonga's plan was to teach Demiurge the hard-learned lessons of how to control the magic mirror. This was what Momonga had meant when he spoke to Demiurge about another security net. Although it would have been simpler to leave this task to his subordinates, Momonga wanted to handle this task personally. The truth was that he wanted to use his can-do working attitude to inspire and gain the respect of his subordinates. Therefore, he couldn't be seen to give up halfway.
Still, why can't I switch to a higher vantage point? If only there were a manual.
With these thoughts in mind, Momonga went about the painstaking work of figuring the mirror's controls out by boring, repetitive trial and error. He did not know how long it had been. It might have only been a while, but so far his work had not borne fruit, and he could not help but feel like this was all a waste of time. Momonga casually waved his hand with a vacant expression, and his field of vision suddenly expanded.
Oh!
Surprise, delight, pride, Momonga's exclamation was filled with all of these. At his wits' end, he made a random gesture, and the screen suddenly did as he wanted. This was a cry of joy one would expect out of a programmer who had pulled 8 hours' worth of overtime. Cheering and clapping answered him. The source of these two sounds was Sebas.
Congratulations, Lord Momonga. Your servant Sebas stands in awe of your prowess.
Granted, this was the fruit of extensive trial and error, so you don't need to go that far. Momonga thought that. But when he saw that Sebas looked quite happy, he decided to humbly accept the butler's praise.
Thank you, Sebas. Although I apologize for making you accompany me for so long.
What are you saying? Staying by your side and obeying your orders is the reason for a butler's existence, Lord Momonga. There is no need to thank or apologize to me. Although, it is true that this process took quite some time. Lord Momonga, would you like to take a break?
No, there's no need for that. Undead like myself are not affected by negative statuses like fatigue. If you're tired, you may go and rest.
Thank you for your kindness, but it would be unthinkable for a butler to rest while his master worked. With the aid of magic items, I am not affected by fatigue either. Please allow me to stay by your side until the end, Lord Momonga.
Momonga realized one thing from his conversations with the NPCs. Namely, they casually used game terms in their speech. For instance, skills, job classes, items, levels, negative statuses, and so on. If he could use game terms with them in an unironic way, it might be easier to give them orders. After agreeing to Sebas' request, he continued studying the ways to control the mirror. Finally, he discovered a method to adjust the height of his viewpoint. Momonga smiled in satisfaction and began looking for a populated area. It was located roughly 10 kilometers south of Nazarick. There was a forest nearby, and wheat fields surrounded the village. It appeared to be a rustic farming village. By the looks of things, the village itself was not very developed. As Momonga zoomed in on the village, he felt that something was amiss. People were running in and out of their houses this early in the morning. They looked panicked.
Are they holding a festival?
No, that is not a festival.
That steely voice came from Sebas, who was watching the display with a keen look in his eye as he stood beside Momonga. There was an undercurrent of disgust in Sebas's stern words. As Momonga enlarged the image, he too furrowed his non-existent brows. Fully armored knights were swinging their longswords at the villagers, who were dressed in rough clothes. It was a massacre. A villager fell with every swing of a knight's sword. The villagers could not resist them and could only run away. The knights pursued and killed the fleeing villagers. There were horses eating the grain in the field. Those horses must have belonged to the knights. Momonga scoffed, intending to change the image. This village had no value to him. If he could extract more information from it, perhaps he might have a reason to save them. But as things stood, there was no reason to save this village. He should abandon them. Momonga was taken aback by how he could make such a heartless decision. A cruel slaughter was occurring before his eyes, but the only thing he could think of was the good of Nazarick. There was nothing like pity, anger, or worry, basic human emotions anyone should have. It felt like he was watching a TV show about animals and insects, where the strong ate the weak. Could it be that as one of the undead, he no longer considered himself part of humanity? No, how could that be? Momonga struggled to find an excuse to justify his thinking. He was not an agent of justice. He was level 100, but like he had told Mare, this world's commoners might well be level 100 as well. Therefore, he could not tread blindly into this unknown world. Although it looked like the knights were conducting a one-sided slaughter of the villagers, there might be other reasons at work here, which he didn't know about. Reasons like illness, judgment, setting an example, and others like them kept appearing in his mind. And if he stepped in and defeated the knights, he might earn the ire of the country they belonged to. Momonga stretched out his bony hand and rubbed his skull as he thought. Could it be that after becoming an undead being, who was immune to mind-affecting effects, he had become inured to scenes like this? Definitely not. He waved his hand again, showing a scene from another part of the village. It seemed like two knights were trying to pull a violently struggling villager off another knight. The man was pulled away, his arms were held, and he was rendered motionless where he stood. Before Momonga's eyes, the man was stabbed with a sword. The blade entered his body and exited from the other side of him. It should have been a fatal blow, but the longsword did not stop. 1, 2, 3 strikes. The knight seemed to be taking out his anger on the villager as he hacked at the man's body. In the end, the knight kicked away the villager, who collapsed to the ground while spurting his blood into the air. The villager looked straight at Momonga. No, this might just have been a coincidence. It was definitely a coincidence. There was no way for anyone to detect the mirror's surveillance, apart from anti-divination spells. Frothy blood leaked from the villager's mouth as he tried to speak. His eyes were unfocused, and Momonga could not tell where he was looking. Even so, with what may have been his dying breaths, he gasped his last words.
Please, save my daughters. What do you intend to do?
Sebas seemed to have been waiting for this moment to speak. There could only be one answer. Momonga replied coldly.
Nothing. There is no reason, value, or benefit in rescuing them.
Understood.
Momonga nonchalantly looked at Sebas, at the phantom image of his past guildmate.
This. Touch me.
Just then, Momonga remembered something.
When someone's in trouble, it's only natural to help them.
When Momonga had just started out in Yggdrasil, hunting down characters of heteromorphic races was a common practice, and Momonga, who had chosen such a race, had been PK'd countless times. Just when he was about to leave Yggdrasil, those words, spoken by that man, had saved him. If not for those words, Momonga would not be here. Momonga sighed softly, and then he smiled. Now that he had recalled that memory, he had no choice but to go save them.
I will repay that debt. Besides, sooner or later I'll have to test my fighting strength in this world.
After saying that to his absent friend, Momonga enlarged the view of the village until he saw everything. After that, he tried to pick out the surviving villagers.
Sebas, put Nazarick on maximum alert. I will go first, and you will tell Albedo, who is standing by next door, to follow me after fully equipping herself. However, I forbid her to bring Ginangagap. After that, prepare support units. Something might happen which may result in my inability to retreat. Therefore, the units sent to the village should be adept at stealth, or have the ability to go invisible.
I understand, but I wish to request the task of defending your person to be given to me.
Then who will relay my orders? These knights are currently sacking the village, which means there might be knights near Nazarick who might attack us. Therefore, you must stay.
The image changed, and now it showed a girl sending a knight flying with a punch. The girl was leading an even younger girl as they ran away. They were probably sisters. Momonga immediately opened his inventory and withdrew the staff of Ainz Gon. Just as the girl planned to flee, she was slashed in the back. Since time was tight, Momonga swiftly incanted the spell.
Yay!
It had no limits on distance and a 0% chance of a teleport mishap. The spell Momonga used was the most accurate and potent of such spells in Yggdrasil. The scene before him changed in an instant. The fact that the opposition had not used teleport blocking filled Momonga with relief. If he was denied the chance to rescue them and was ambushed instead, it would have been bad. The scene before his eyes was the same as he had seen earlier. Two terrified girls were in front of him. The one who looked like the elder sister had a braid of straw blonde hair that reached down to her breasts. Her skin, healthily tanned from working in the sun, was now deathly pale from fear, and her dark eyes were wet with tears. The little sister, the younger girl, buried her face in her sister's waist, trembling in fright. Momonga gazed coldly at the knight standing before the two girls. Perhaps he was shocked by Momonga's sudden appearance, but the knight simply stared at Momonga, having apparently forgotten to swing the sword he was holding. Momonga had grown up without knowing the touch of violence on his life. He did not think that the world in which he currently resided was a simulation, but the real thing. Even so, he did not feel the slightest bit of fear at the knight before him who held a sword. This calmness allowed him to make a cold, cruel decision. Momonga reached out an empty hand and cast his spell.
Grasp hard!
This spell was one that crushed a foe's heart, and among the 10 tiers of spells, it was an instant death spell of the 9th tier. Many of the necromantic spells which Momonga was adept with possessed instant death properties, and this was one of them. Momonga had chosen to open with this spell, because even if it was resisted, the spell would still temporarily stun his opponent. If the spell had been resisted, his plan was to take the 2 girls and jump back into the still open gate. He had already planned his route of retreat, since he was not sure what his opponents could do. However, it would seem those preparations would not be necessary. A feeling of something soft crushing beneath Momonga's fingers traveled up his arm, and the knight collapsed silently to the ground. Momonga looked down upon the fallen knight. It would seem that even killing someone did not stir any emotions within him. There was no guilt, fear, or confusion in his heart, which was like the surface of a calm lake. Why was it like this?
I see. So it's not just my body, but my mind that's no longer human.
Momonga took a step forward. The elder sister squeaked in confusion as Momonga walked past her, probably in fear at the knight's demise. Momonga had clearly come to rescue her. However, the girl was seemingly confused by Momonga's sudden appearance and actions. What was she thinking? Although he had his doubts, Momonga did not have time to worry about them. After verifying the wounds on the eldest sister's back through her tatty old clothes, and glared at a knight who had just emerged from a nearby house, the knight saw Momonga as well, and took a step back in fear.
So, you dare to chase girls, but not someone who can fight back.
As Momonga stared down the quivering knight, he considered what spell to use next. Momonga's opening spell was one that he particularly favored, Grasp Hard. This sort of magic was Momonga's specialty. Momonga had used his innate skills to increase the chances of instant death, and his necromancy-enhancing abilities improved the effectiveness of Grasp Hard even further. However, it meant that he could not gauge the strength of that knight. Therefore, he should use another spell against this knight, something that did not instantly kill him. This way, he could measure the strength of this world and verify his own power.
Since I've come all this way, I might as well run a few experiments. You shall make a fine test subject.
Momonga's necromancy spells were augmented, but the simple attack spells he used were not very destructive. In addition, since metal armor was weak against electrical effects in Yggdrasil, most people enchanted their plate armor with electricity resistance. Therefore, Momonga deliberately chose to attack his foe with an electrical spell to see how much damage it would do. Because his aim was not to kill his opposition, there was no need to enhance its effects with skills.
Dragon Lightning!
A dragon-shaped bolt of white electricity crackled around Momonga's arms and shoulders. The bolt flared brightly as it instantly surged out at the knight Momonga was pointing at. There was no way to avoid it or defend against it. The knight who had been electrocuted by the dragon-shaped lightning bolt shone brilliantly for an instant. Miserable as his death was, it was still a beautiful sight. The light in his eyes faded and the knight collapsed to the ground like a puppet whose strings had been cut. The body beneath the armor was charred black and gave off a vile stench. Momonga had been planning to follow up with another spell, but he felt silly as he noted the weakness of the knights.
How pathetic. He died so easily.
To Momonga, the 5th tier Dragon Lightning was a weak spell. When hunting level 100 players, Momonga would usually cast spells of the 8th tier and higher. Magic of the 5th tier and below would almost never see use. Now that he knew the knights were weak enough to be finished off by 5th tier magic, Momonga's tension vanished in an instant. Of course, it could be that these 2 knights were especially weak among their kind, but still, it was a great relief. Still, the plan to retreat with magic had not changed. These knights might be focused on offense. In Yggdrasil, a blow to the neck counted as a critical hit and dealt extra damage, but in the real world, it might well be fatal. Instead of relaxing, Momonga raised his guard. It would be too foolish to die because he was careless. Next, he ought to continue testing his powers. Momonga activated one of his skills.
Create mid-tier undead. Death Knight.
This was one of Momonga's skills, which could create various undead. The Death Knight in question was Momonga's favorite undead monster, which he used as a meat shield. It was roughly level 35, but although its attack power was only comparable to a level 25 monster, its defensive power was very good, equivalent to a level 40 monster. That said, monsters of that level were useless to Momonga for the most part. However, the Death Knight had 2 very important skills. One of them was the ability to draw away enemy attacks. The other was that just once, they could survive any attack with 1 HP. Momonga liked using Death Knights as shields because of these 2 skills. This time round, he was also looking forward to using the Death Knight in a similar way. In Yggdrasil, when he used his skills to create undead, they would appear out of the sky in their summoner's vicinity. However, things seemed different in this world. A cloud of black fog appeared. The cloud headed straight for the body of the knight whose heart had been crushed, and then enveloped it. The mist slowly expanded and melded with the knight's body. After that, the knight wobbled before slowly rising to its feet like a zombie. Momonga heard the shrieks from the sisters, but he had no time to worry about them. After all, he was quite surprised at the sight before his eyes. With a wet, dripping sound, several rills of black ichor oozed out from between the gaps in the knight's helmet. It must have come from the knight's mouth. The black fluid flowed out without end until it covered the knight's entire body. It looked like a human being that had been swallowed by a slime. Completely surrounded by the black liquid, the knight's body began to twist and change. After several seconds, the black liquid fell off the body of what was now a Death Knight. It was now 2.3 meters tall, and its body was correspondingly bulkier. It no longer resembled a human being, but a wild beast. In its left hand, it held a large shield that covered 3/4 of its body, a tower shield, and in its right hand, it held a wavy-bladed flamberg. This 130-centimeter long weapon was intended to be held with both hands, but the massive Death Knight could easily wield it with just one. A dreadful red-black aura covered the Flamberg's blade, which pulsed like a heart. Its massive body was sheathed in a suit of full-plate armor made from some black metal, and it was covered in red tracery that resembled blood vessels. The armor was also covered in spikes as far as anyone could see, and it looked like a man-shaped incarnation of brutality. Demonic horns sprang from its head, and one could see its rotted face underneath them. Twin points of hateful, murderous light shone in the eye sockets of its ghastly visage. Its tattered black cape blowing in the wind, the Death Knight awaited Momonga's orders. The way it carried itself was truly deserving of the name Death Knight. Much like he had with the primal fire elemental and moonlight wolves he had summoned, Momonga used the mental bond with his summoned monster and pointed to the corpse of the knight who had been slain by the dragon lightning.
Exterminate all the knights who are attacking this village.
So mighty was its cry that it shook the air, and it was so filled with bloodlust that everyone who heard it broke out in goosebumps. The Death Knight ran, fast as lightning. The way it charged forward without hesitation was like a hunting hound that had scented its quarry. The undead hatred for the living made it sensitive to the prey that it would soon slaughter. As the Death Knight's silhouette shrank into the distance, Momonga was keenly aware of a difference between this new world and Yggdrasil. That was independence. Originally, the Death Knight should have stayed by its summoner's side to await his orders and attack any enemies which approached. Yet, it had disregarded that order and launched an attack of its own accord. This difference might be a fatal vulnerability in an unknown situation like this one. At a loss for words, Momonga scratched his head and sighed.
It ran off? To think a shield would abandon the person it was supposed to protect. Then again, I did tell it to do so.
Momonga reproached himself for his miscalculation. Although he could make quite a few more Death Knights, it was best to conserve limited use abilities while he was not sure of the enemy and the situation. Still, Momonga was a backline mage. Without a frontliner to run interference for him, he was effectively naked. Therefore, he would need to create another defender. This time, he would try making one without a corpse. Just as Momonga was thinking about that, a humanoid shape came through the still open gate. At the same time, the gate's duration ended, and it slowly disappeared. A person, clad in a suit of full-body black plate armor, stood before Momonga. That suit of armor looked like a demon. It was covered in spikes, and did not expose the slightest bit of flesh. Its clawed gauntlets grasped a black kite shield in one hand, and a bardiche that radiated a sickly green glow in the other. A blood-red cape blew in the wind, while the doublet beneath was also the carmine of fresh blood.
The preparations took some time. I apologize for my late arrival.
Albedo's levels were in the defense-focused Dark Knight class. As a result, among the 3 level 100 warriors of Nazarick, Sebas, Cocytus, and Albedo possessed the greatest defensive ability. In other words, she was the strongest shield in Nazarick.
No, it's fine. You came just in time.
Thank you. Then, how shall we dispose of these inferior life forms? If you do not wish to stain your hands with their blood, I will gladly eliminate them on your behalf, Lord Momonga.
What exactly did Sebas tell you?
Albedo did not respond.
I see. You didn't pay attention then. My intention is to save this village. Our enemies are the knights in armor, like the corpse over there.
Momonga saw that Albedo nodded in understanding, and turned his eyes elsewhere.
Now then,
The two girls shrank under Momonga's unyielding gaze and tried their best to make themselves as small as possible. Perhaps it was because of the Death Knight, or because they heard its roar, or because they heard Albedo's words, which made them tremble uncontrollably. Perhaps it was all of them. Momonga felt that he should show his intention to help and reached his hand out to the elder sister, but the two girls seemed to have gotten the wrong impression. The elder sister wet herself, followed by the younger sister. The stench of ammonia filled the surrounding air. Fatigue washed over Momonga like a tide. He had no idea what to do, and Albedo was no help. So Momonga decided to continue trying to express his good intentions. As a working man, Momonga had long since trained up his ability to ignore things. Momonga, who pretended not to notice, opened his inventory and withdrew a backpack from it. Although it was called an infinite backpack, it could only hold up to 500 kilos of items. Yggdrasil players commonly put their immediate use items into this bag, because the items within the bag could be assigned to hotkeys in the game interface. After digging through several of these backpacks, he found a small phial containing a red potion. It was a minor healing potion. This potion could restore 50 HP, and beginners in Yggdrasil frequently used it. However, Momonga, as he was now, had no need for this item at all. This was because this potion healed through positive energy. To an undead being like Momonga, this potion was like a damaging poison. However, not every member in the guild was undead, so Momonga kept some of these items just in case.
Here, drink this.
Momonga offered the red potion. The elder sister's face was pale with fright as she replied,
Blood? I'll drink it. Just, please, spare my little sister.
No! Don't drink it!
He watched the little sister weeping as she tried to stop her elder sister, while the elder sister apologized to her little sister while taking the potion. Their reactions confused Momonga. After all, he had saved them in a tight spot, and had even offered them a potion. Why were they acting like this in front of him? What was going on here?
What? They don't trust me at all. Even though I wanted to leave them to their fate at first, I ended up being their savior in the end. They should be crying and hugging me in gratitude. Isn't this sort of thing common in manga and movies? But the exact opposite is happening now. Could it be that being instantly accepted is a privilege of the beautiful?
Just as a baffled expression dawned on Momonga's fleshless face, a dulcet voice said,
Lord Momonga offered you a healing potion out of the kindness of his heart. But to think you would actually dare to refuse it. You inferior lifeforms deserve 10,000 deaths for that.
Albedo raised her bardiche in a natural way, preparing to behead them on the spot. Considering they had treated him like this, despite how he had risked himself to save them, Momonga could understand Albedo's feelings. However, if he let her go ahead and slay them, then there would be no point to this rescue.
Wait! Don't be so hasty! There's a time and place for that, so lower your weapon.
Understood, Lord Momonga.
Albedo replied gently as she withdrew her bardiche. However, she was still radiating murderous intent, to the point where the two girls were gritting their teeth in fear. In response, Momonga's non-existent stomach began cramping up. In any case, he had to leave this place as soon as possible. If he remained here, who knew what other tragedies might occur? Momonga offered the potion again.
This is a healing potion. It is harmless. Hurry up and drink it.
Momonga's words were gentle, but backed with an adamant will. There was also the implied threat that if she did not drink, she would be slain. The elder sister's eyes went wide, and she gulped the potion down. After that, a look of surprise filled her face.
No way!
She touched her back, then wiggled her body in disbelief, and patted her back again.
I assume that the pain is gone?
Yes, it is.
The elder sister nodded stiffly to indicate that it did not hurt. It would seem that the minor wounds on her back were easily remedied by a low-tier healing potion. Now that he had their trust, Momonga continued by asking a question. There was no way around that question, and depending on the answer, it would affect his future movements.
Do you know of magic?
Yes. Yes, I do. The alchemist who comes by our village, my friend, knows how to use magic.
Is that so? Well, that makes things easy to explain. I am a magic caster.
Momonga then cast his spells.
Anti-life cocoon. Wall of protection from arrows.
A dome of light, roughly 3 meters in radius, surrounded the sisters. The second spell was not visible to the naked eye, but there was a subtle change in the air. He had originally planned to use an anti-magic spell as well, but he didn't know what sort of magic existed in this world, so he did not do so for the time being. If the enemy had magic casters, then that was just their bad luck.
I have cast a defensive spell that keeps living creatures from coming near you, as well as a spell that weakens the effectiveness of shooting attacks. As long as you stay here, you should be safe.
After calmly explaining the effects of the magic to the 2 dumbfounded sisters, Momonga withdrew a pair of unremarkable-looking horns. Apparently, the magic did not obstruct them, since they sailed straight through the force field as Momonga tossed them to the sisters' side.
These are called the horns of the Goblin General. If you blow them, goblins, in other words small monsters, will appear. Order them to protect you.
In Yggdrasil, electronic data crystals dropped from monsters, which could be slotted into almost any sort of item, apart from certain expendable items, in order to create just about any item a player could think of. In addition, there were certain artifacts which could not be created by players and had fixed stats. These horns were examples of them. Momonga had used the horn before, and at that time it managed to summon a goblin troop, 12 or so goblins with some measure of ability. There were 2 goblin archers, 1 goblin mage, a goblin cleric, 2 goblin riders and their wolf mounts, as well as 1 goblin leader. Although it was called a goblin troop, their numbers were few, and they were very weak. This was a trash item for Momonga. The surprise was why he had not disposed of it yet. Still, Momonga felt quite smart for being able to put this trash item to good use. Another good point about this item was that the summoned goblins would linger until they were killed instead of vanishing after a while. That could at least buy the girls some time. As Momonga finished, he turned to leave, bringing Albedo with him as he headed to the village. However, after a few steps, a couple of voices called out to him.
Thank you for saving us.
Thank you.
Those words stopped Momonga in his tracks, and when he turned around, he saw the 2 girls, their eyes brimming with tears as they thanked him. He simply replied,
Think nothing of it.
And this may be selfish of us, but you are the only one we can count on. Please, please save our parents.
All right. If they are still alive, I will rescue them.
The sisters' eyes went wide as they heard Momonga's words. Their faces reflected the disbelief in their hearts, but soon they came to their senses and lowered their heads in thanks.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And And may we know...
The girl's voice trailed off, and then she asked in a mumble,
May we know your name?
Momonga almost responded by reflex, but in the end, he did not state his name. The name Momonga was that of the guildmaster of the former Ainz Gon. Then, what should he call himself now? What was the name of the last man who remained in the great tomb of Nazarick?
Ah, that's it. Remember my name well. I am Ainz Gon.
The mighty roar shattered the air. It was the signal for a slaughter, to become a massacre of a different sort. In the blink of an eye, the hunters had become the hunted. Landis de Galanpo had probably cursed his gods more times in the past 10 seconds than he had in the rest of his life. If the gods really did exist, then they should defeat that evil being right now. Landis was a faithful man. Why had the gods abandoned him? The gods did not exist. In the past, he had looked down on those who did not believe in the gods as fools. After all, if the gods did not exist, how could the priests work their magic? And now, he realized that he was the foolish one. The monster before him, a death knight, for want of a better word, drew closer. He took 2 steps back in response, trying to get away from it. A shrill, creaking noise came from his armor, and the sword he clutched in both hands was trembling uncontrollably. He was not the only one. The other 18 knights surrounding the Death Knight were all acting the same way. Although they were filled with fear, none of them ran. This was not courage. The grinding of their teeth could attest to that. If they could, they would run as fast and as far away as they could. It was because they knew there was no escape. Landis's eyes shifted, pleading for help. This square was at the center of the village, where Landis and his men had gathered 60 or so villagers. They looked fearfully at Landis and his men, while a group of children were hiding behind a wooden watchtower. Some of the children held sticks, but none of them was in a fighting stance. It was all they could do not to drop their sticks. During Landis's attack on the village, they had chased the villagers to the central square. They searched the houses, and then to root out anyone who was hiding in the cellars, they poured in alchemical oils and set them on fire. There were 4 knights standing guard around the village with bows, and their job was to shoot down anyone who tried to escape the village. They had done this several times now, and it could be said that they were old hands at this sort of thing. The massacre had taken a fair bit of time, but it had been successful, and they had gathered the surviving villagers into one place. After that, they would release some of the prisoners as bait. It should have been like that, but Landis still remembered that moment. The sight of Orion flying through the air after the last villagers fled into the square. It should have been impossible. Nobody knew what was going on. How could they understand the reason why a trained, grown man in full plate armor, which still had some weight even if it was lightened by magic, could fly through the air like a ball? After soaring about 7 meters through the air, he fell to the earth with a thunderous crash and lay still. A bone-chilling monster stood where Orion had been. The hair-raising undead being called a Death Knight lowered the tower shield that had bashed Orion and stood before them. This was when their despair began. Their panicked squeals echoed through the air. One of the men, huddled together with his comrades, could not bear the oppressive terror and fled with a scream. Under these extreme circumstances, it was only natural that, when stretched to the breaking point, people would snap. However, among all of the fleeing man's comrades, not one of them joined him. The reason would soon be evident. A black gale whirled past the field of Londis' vision. The Death Knight's body was larger than a normal human's, but its nimble grace was far beyond anyone's expectations. The fleeing man only managed to take 3 steps. Just as he was about to take his 4th step, an arc of silver brilliance cleaved his body in 2. The bisected left and right halves of his body collapsed in opposite directions. A sour stench filled the air as his pink internal organs spilled out. The blood-covered Death Knight roared as it swung its sword. It was a roar of joy. Its look of delight was unmistakable, even on its rotted face. As an overwhelmingly superior slaughterer, it savored the despair and terror of the pitiful humans who couldn't even survive a single one of its blows. Nobody dared attack, though they had swords in hand. At first, they had tried an attack, though they were afraid. But even those blades which had made it past their foe's defense could not strike a telling blow through the Death Knight's armor. In contrast, the Death Knight did not use its sword, but sent Londis flying with a shield bash, and it did so without using enough force to kill. It was clearly toying with them, given the way it did not use its full strength. It was plain to see that the Death Knight wanted to enjoy the dying struggles of these humans. The Death Knight only dealt fatal blows in earnest when the knights tried to escape. The first knight to run was Ririk. He was a nice guy, but a bad drunk. His limbs were chopped off, followed by his head. After seeing the 2 deaths, the other knights knew the score, so they did not dare to flee. Their attacks were ineffective, and they would be killed if they tried to run. The only thing they could do was wait their turn to be tortured to death. Although there was no way to see their faces below the full helms they wore, everyone present was keenly aware of their fate. The wails of grown men reduced to children echoed throughout the village. These men, who had always oppressed the weak, had not thought that one day they would be on the receiving end of that treatment.
No, please no. Oh God.
After hearing these cries for salvation, the strength left Londis' legs, and he almost fell to his knees. He loudly cursed the gods, or was it a prayer to them?
You lot! Go hold that monster back!
A desperate knight shouted. He knew that his fate was sealed. His words sounded like an off-key psalm. The man who spoke was standing next to the Death Knight. The way he was stumbling back on his tiptoes to back away from the corpse of his comrade was quite comical. Londis frowned as he looked on that man in his pathetic state. It was hard to tell who had spoken those words, because their closed helmets covered their faces, and their voices were distorted by fear. Still, he knew that only one man would speak like that. Captain Bellius. Londus's frown deepened. Overcome by his lewd desires, he had tried to rape a village girl, and then sought help from others after he got into a fight with her father. After he was pulled off the other man, he vented his anger by stabbing the father with his sword. That was the kind of man he was. However, his family was quite wealthy in their country, and he had joined this unit because of his family's riches. Everything had gone wrong because he had been made their leader.
I'm not someone who should die here. All of you, hurry up and protect me. Be my shields.
Nobody moved. He might have been appointed their leader, but he was not popular at all. Nobody would throw their lives away for a man like this. However, the Death Knight responded to his shouting, and it slowly turned to face Bellius. The only thing praiseworthy about him was that he could make so much noise while standing in front of the Death Knight. Just as Londus began to respect this odd quality of Bellius, he heard the man shriek in terror.
Money! I'll give you money! 200 gold pieces! No, 500 gold pieces!
Those were considerable amounts he was talking about. However, right now, it was like telling them that he would pay them to jump off a 500-meter cliff. Although nobody responded, one person, no, half a person, moved as though in reply to him. The right half of the bisected corpse gripped Bellius's ankles firmly. The bloody gargling from its mouth hardly sounded like words. Bellius screamed in an unnaturally high-pitched voice. The onlooking knights and villagers were frozen in fear, their skin covered in goosebumps. Squire zombies. In Yggdrasil, creatures killed by the Death Knight would become undead of comparable power, haunting the place where they were killed. According to the game's rules, those damned souls who fell to the Death Knight's blade would become its slaves for all eternity. Bellius stopped screaming and fell like a puppet whose strings had been cut, facing the sky. He must have passed out. The Death Knight drew closer to the defenseless man and stabbed his gravy-bladed flamberg down. Bellius's body twitched, and woken by the incredible pain, Bellius screamed. Using both hands, Bellius desperately grabbed the flamberg that had already penetrated his body. But the Death Knight paid his futile struggles no heed and worked the flamberg like a saw. His flesh and armor were cruelly torn open, and fresh blood flew everywhere. Bellius's body shuddered, and then he breathed his last. Only then was the Death Knight satisfied, and it stepped away from Bellius's corpse.
No. Please, no. Oh,
Their screams came from seeing the ghastly sight before them. If they ran, they would die swiftly. But if they stayed, they would die horribly. They knew that perfectly well, but still, they could not bring themselves to move.
Get a grip!
Londus's shout tore through their wailing. The world was filled with silence, as though time was standing still.
Fall back!
Sound the horn for the horsemen and archers to come here. The rest of you, do your best to buy some time for the hornblower. I'd rather not die like that if you don't mind. Now move!
Everyone moved in an instant. There was no sign of their earlier panic. Everyone moved in silent unison, like a raging waterfall. Their mechanical obedience to their orders, without thinking, created a miracle. There was no way they could move so immaculately again. The knights each did what they were supposed to do. They had to protect the knight, who would blow the horn and signal the others. One of the soldiers who had taken several steps back lowered his sword and withdrew his horn from his bag. The Death Knight charged, as though reacting to the horn being taken out. Everyone was shocked. Could it be that the Death Knight wanted to destroy their means of escape so he could kill them to the last man? The flood of darkness drew closer and closer, and everyone knew that stepping forward to try and stop it was certain death. However, the knights still climbed over each other to block the Death Knight one after the other. Their fear was wiped away by an even greater fear, and they surged forward to become obstacles. Every time its shield moved, a knight was smashed through the air. Every time its blade flashed, a knight was cut in two.
Dizu! Murray! Behead the fallen! Hurry before they come back as monsters!
Yes, sir!
The named knights hurriedly ran toward their murdered comrades. The shield swung, and a knight was thrown into the air. His body was bisected by the flamberge. 4 men had lost their lives in the blink of an eye. Though Londus was still gripped with fear, he readied his sword against the coming of the jet-black storm, like a martyr preparing to give his life for his faith. It might have been a meaningless gesture, but Londus did not intend to wait for death. Giving voice to a battle cry, he swung his sword with all his strength at the oncoming Death Knight. Perhaps it was because of his circumstances, but Londus's muscles broke their limit and surprised him. It might have been the best blow Londus had ever struck in his life. The Death Knight swung its flamberge as well. In an instant, the world before Londus spun, and he saw his decapitated corpse collapse to the ground as his sword swung through thin air. Just then, at that moment, the horn rang out. Momonga, Ainz, raised his head as the sound of the horn reached him from the direction of the village. The area around him was covered with the corpses of the knights who had been standing guard here. The stink of blood hung heavy in the air, but Ainz paid it no heed as he ran his experiments. Just then, he chided himself for getting his priorities wrong. Ainz cast down the sword in his hand. The sword, which had originally belonged to a knight, fell to the ground, its gleaming, razor-sharp edge now stained with dirt.
I've said it before, but this physical damage reduction is quite something.
Lord Ainz will go.
Ainz will do, Albedo.
Ainz's request to be called by a truncated version of his name threw Albedo into confusion.
Am I really allowed to do that? Would it not be disrespectful to shorten the name of the leader of the 41 Supreme Beings? Especially if it's also the name of Nazarik's rulers?
Ainz did not think that it was a big deal. However, her words meant that she respected the name of Ainz Gon, which pleased Ainz. Therefore, his reply was phrased in a gentle tone.
It's fine, Albedo. Until my former comrades arrive, that is my name. I permit you to shorten it.
I understand. No, but please let me address you with the appropriate respect. Then, my master, Lord Ainz. Yes, that's right.
Albedo twisted her body shyly. However, since she was in full body armor, Ainz could not see her beautiful face. To him, she was just acting strangely.
Could it be? Could it be that I'm the only one who's allowed to address you in such a way?
No. Having someone address me by such a long name all the time would be annoying. So I would like to have everyone do the same thing.
Is that so? That's right. Yes, that's what I thought.
Albedo, what do you think of the name I chose?
I think that name suits you very well. It fits my beloved... It fits you. In your capacity as the one who united the Supreme Beings.
This name was intended to represent the 41 of us, and this includes your maker, Tabula Smaragdina. However, I ignored the feelings of your master and the others, and took that name for myself on a whim. How do you think they would feel about that?
Although I fear to anger you, I pray you will allow me to speak. If my words displease you, then I will gladly take my own life if you command it. I feel that some of the supreme beings who abandoned us might object to that name being used by the one who stayed with us until now, Lord Momonga. However, they are not here, so if you wish to use that name, all I feel is happiness, Lord Momonga.
Albedo lowered her head after she finished speaking, and Ainz remained silent. The phrase, abandoned us, swirled in his mind like a vortex. His past companions had left him for their own reasons. Yggdrasil was just a game, and they could not abandon their real lives for a game. Momonga felt the same way too. Yet, could it really be said that he, who had been fixated on Ainz Ul Gon and the great underground tomb of Nazarick, had not been suppressing his anger toward his former comrades?
They abandoned me.
That might be so, but it might not be. Human emotions are a complicated matter, and there is no right answer. Raise your head, Albedo. I understand your feelings. All right. It's decided. This shall be my name. Until my comrades object, I shall be Ainz Ul Gon.
Understood. The thought that our most exalted master, and the man I love most, would bear this glorious name fills me with joy.
The man I love most?
The uneasy Ainz decided not to worry about this for now.
Is that so? I'm glad to hear that.
Then, Lord Ainz, would you like to spend some time here? Although I would be happy to stand by Lord Ainz's side, Right. A stroll through the woods would be fine too.
He could not do that. Ainz had come to save this village. The parents that the sisters had asked him to save were already dead. As he thought of their corpses, he scratched his head. The sight of their bodies reminded him of a dead insect by the roadside. There was no pity, no sadness, no anger.
Well, a stroll might be all right. After all, there is nothing of importance to do. The Death Knight seems quite happy to do his job.
As expected of an undead being that Lord Ainz made. His marvelous execution of his duties is truly praiseworthy.
The undead made by Ainz's magic and his skills were stronger than ordinary monsters of their kind due to Ainz's class skills. Naturally, the same applied to the Death Knight he had just created. However, it was only a level 35 monster, and it was nothing in comparison to the monsters which required XP to create, like Overlord Wiseman and Grim Reaper Thanatos. The fact that it was still fighting until now meant that the enemies were weak. In other words, there was no danger. He wanted to jump for joy when he thought about it, but he had to play the role of the dignified master, so Ainz quashed that thought. However, he clenched his fists tightly under his robe.
The enemies who attacked the village were too weak. Now then, Let us go check on the survivors.
Before Momonga set out, he realized that he had some things to do first. To begin with, he deactivated the special effects of the staff of Ainz Gon. The malevolent aura which wreathed it vanished, like a candle flame in the wind. Next, he withdrew a full-face mask from his inventory. It was gaudily decorated, and its expression was hard to describe, being somewhere between crying and anger. It resembled a Balinese barong mask. The mask looked creepy, but it had no special powers. It was a simple cosmetic item which did not contain a trace of data. Only those who were logged on to Yggdrasil for more than 2 hours, between 1900 to 2200 on Christmas Eve, would have this mask. No, as long as they were in the game during that period of time, they would automatically receive it. It could be called a cursed item. This mask was known as the Mask of the Jealous, or the Jealous Mask. Once, when he wore this mask, he was flooded by messages. Has the company gone mad? We've been waiting for this. Nobody in our guild has it. Can I PK him? I'm done with being a human being. And other such things in a certain large message board. Then, he took out a pair of gloves. Their rough exterior betrayed the fact that they were crudely made and had no special properties. These gloves were called Yarn Graper, and they were an armor item made by one of Ainz Gon's members for fun. Their only ability was to increase the wearer's strength. He used these items to hide his skeletal appearance. Naturally, there was a reason for this emergency camouflage. It was because Ainz realized he had made a fatal mistake. Ainz was used to Yggdrasil, and looking like a skeleton did not frighten him. However, to the people of this world, Ainz's appearance was synonymous with terror. Both the sisters who had nearly lost their lives and the fully armored knights were afraid of him. For the time being, he would use magic items to change his appearance from a dreadful monster to a menacing magic caster. That ought to reduce how frightening he appeared. Then, he thought about the staff. In the end, he decided to keep it with him. Besides, it was not a problem for him.
Rather than beg your god for aid, you should not have massacred these people in the first place.
With that line only an atheist could come up with, Ainz looked away from the corpse, whose fingers were folded into a gesture of prayer, and cast a spell.
Fly!
Ainz floated lightly into the sky. Albedo soon followed him shortly afterwards.
Death Knight! If there are any surviving knights, leave them alive. They are useful to me.
The Death Knight sent its acknowledgement of Ainz's will back through the mental link they shared. It was difficult to put the distant Death Knight's thoughts into words. Ainz flew toward the place from whence the hornblast had come as quickly as he could. The wind lashed at his body, because he had never flown this fast before in Yggdrasil. The robe plastered to his body felt a little uncomfortable, but that passed swiftly. He soon reached the sky above the village, and Ainz looked down on the landscape beneath him. Ainz discovered that part of the village square was darkened, as though it had absorbed water. There were many corpses, and a few trembling knights, as well as the Death Knight. Ainz counted the panting knights, who were too tired to even move. There were 4 of them in total. Though there were more than he expected, a few extra would not be a problem.
Death Knight, that will be all for now.
His words seemed strangely incongruous with the surroundings, like he was buying something at a store. But to Ainz, this situation was as casual as going shopping. He slowly descended to the ground, accompanied by Albedo. The false knights stared at Ainz with mouths agape. They had been hoping for a rescue, but what had come was the man responsible for everything. And his arrival shattered their hopes.
Greetings, gentlemen. My name is Ainz Gon.
Nobody answered.
If you throw down your arms, I can guarantee your lives. Of course, if you would rather fight.
One sword was cast to the ground. It was shortly followed by the other swords being thrown down, until there were 4 blades on the ground. Nobody spoke during this time.
You seem quite tired. Although, don't you think your heads are held a bit too high before the master of the Death Knight?
The knights immediately prostrated themselves before him, without a single sound. They did not look like vassals before their lord, so much as convicts awaiting execution.
I will permit you to leave with your lives. In exchange, tell your master, your owner, this.
Ainz used the effects of the fly spell to move near one of the knights, and then he removed his helmet with a hand that was not holding the staff of Ainz Gon. He noted the man's exhausted eyes, and their gazes met through the mask.
Do not make trouble around here again. If you cause so much as a disturbance here, I will slaughter you along with the rest of your country.
The trembling knight nodded as hard as he could. His frantic gesture looked quite comical.
Get lost, and make sure to relay this to your master.
He jerked his chin, and the knights fled like rabbits.
This tough guy act is tiring.
Momonga quietly grumbled as he watched the knights run away. If there were no villagers around, he might even have stretched his shoulders. Although he was doing the same thing in the great underground tomb of Nazarick, playing the role of a dignified person was very tiring for an average salaryman like Ainz. Yet, until the curtains closed on this act of his, he had to wear yet another mask. Ainz resisted the urge to sigh, and walked toward the villagers. Albedo followed behind him, her every step accompanied by the clanking of metal.
Clear up your zombie slaves!
Ainz ordered the Death Knight. As Ainz drew closer to them, he could more clearly see the confusion and unease on the villagers' faces. It was not that they were not happy at being rescued from the knights, but frightened by the person before them. Ainz finally realized this. He was powerful, much more so than those knights, so he did not consider this situation from a weak person's point of view. He decided to reflect on this, and pondered it quietly. If he went too close to them, the outcome would be the opposite of what he was hoping for. Therefore, Ainz decided to stop at a distance from them, and spoke in a kindly tone.
You have been saved. Be at ease.
You are...
One of the villagers was saying that, but even in the middle of speaking to Ainz, his eyes never left the Death Knight.
I saw the knights attacking this village, so I came here to help.
Looks of relief dawned on the faces of the villagers. Even so, they could not be completely at ease.
What a pain. Should I try a different approach?
Ainz decided to handle this in a way he did not like much.
That said, this was not for free. I expect a reward commensurate with the number of villagers whom I saved.
The villagers looked at each other. It would seem that they were worried about money. However, their doubtful looks faded away. This crass demand for money in exchange for salvation seemed to have allayed their suspicions somewhat.
With the village in its present state...
Ainz raised his hand to silence the other man before continuing.
We'll discuss that later. I rescued a pair of sisters before I came here. I will go bring them over now. Can you wait here for me?
He had to make sure those sisters did not talk and give away his true identity. Without waiting for them to reply, Ainz slowly headed off. At the same time, he thought about using magic to alter memories. The village chief had a house near the village square. Upon entering, one would be greeted by a large living room, with a kitchen off to one side. A rickety old table and several chairs occupied the center of the room. Ainz surveyed the interior from where he was seated on one of the chairs. The sunlight, which shone through the windows, illuminated every corner of the room, so he could see clearly inside, even without dark vision. He took a look at the woman in the corner of the kitchen, and the farming tools inside the house. There were no manufactured products to be seen anywhere. Just as Ainz thought that there would not be much in the way of technology here, Ainz realized that his thinking might be naive. Still, he was curious about what sort of science that a world with magic would develop. Ainz shifted his hand across the old table to avoid the sunlight. His metal gauntlets were not heavy, but the shabbily made table shook under its weight. The chair also creaked from Ainz sitting on it. This was a textbook definition of the word poverty. Ainz leaned the staff on the table to keep it out of people's way. The way the staff reflected the sunlight in a brilliant display made the run-down old house appear to be some sort of fairy tale wonderland. He recalled the surprised expressions on the villagers' faces, the way their eyes went wide, and how they were lost for words. A surge of pride came over Ainz as the villagers asked about the staff which he and his guildmates had painstakingly crafted. However, his delight was immediately suppressed to normal levels, which made Ainz furrow his non-existent brows. Frankly speaking, Ainz disliked this forceful calming effect. That said, it was also true that allowing his emotions to run wild would make it difficult to solve the challenges ahead of him. With that in mind, Ainz prepared himself for his upcoming task. He had to negotiate payment for rescuing the village with the chief. Of course, Ainz's real objective was to obtain information and not money. However, directly asking for information would be strange. While it would be fine in a small village like this, once the local lords found out, they would begin making their way to him. When they discovered that he knew nothing about this world, there was a high chance that they would try to use him. Was he being too cautious about this? Ainz felt that this was like running across a busy road. A fatal accident could happen at any time. The fatal accident in this case meant encountering the mighty beings of this world. Strength and weakness were two sides of the same coin. For now, Ainz was stronger than everyone he had encountered in this village. However, that did not guarantee that he was stronger than everyone in this world. In addition, Ainz was now undead, and from the terrified reaction of the two girls, he could imagine that undead were not very well received in this world. He had to be aware that since most humans would hate him, they might well attack him. Thus, he had to tread very carefully.
Sorry to keep you waiting.
The chief sat opposite Ainz. His wife stood behind him. His skin was dark and covered in wrinkles. His body was very muscular, and it was obvious that those muscles had been honed through heavy labor. More than half of his hair was white. Though his crudely made cotton shirt was stained by dirt, it did not stink. The tired look on his face made Ainz think he was over 45 years old, but it was hard to tell, because he seemed to have grown older in the past half hour or so. The chief's wife was roughly the same age as her husband. She had been slim and beautiful once, but after long years of working on the farm, that beauty was nowhere to be seen. All that was left were the wrinkles that covered her face. Her shoulder-length black hair was mussed up, and she looked gloomy even under the direct sunlight.
Please, help yourself.
The village chief placed a crude-looking cup on the table. Albedo was not here because she was patrolling the village. Ainz raised his hand, refusing the cup of hot, steaming water. He did not feel thirsty, nor could he remove the mask. However, he felt that he should have refused earlier, given that she had gone to so much trouble for him. The trouble in question concerned the boiled water. First, there was the matter of creating sparks with a flint. Then she had to light wood shavings, or tinder, with those sparks. Then she had to fan the sparks into flames, and when they were big enough, she had to transfer them to the stove. Then she had to boil the water, and by the time that was finished, a long time had passed. This was the first time Ainz had seen water boiled by a hand-started fire. rather than through the use of an electric kettle. He found it quite interesting. Back in his world, he had boiled water on a gas stove, so it was hardly as time-consuming as this. This was also a good opportunity to gather some information on the technological level of this world. With that in mind, Ainz spoke to the chief again.
I do apologize, especially since you went to all this trouble to prepare water for me.
You are too kind. There is no need to apologize.
The fact that Ainz lowered his head to them, however slightly, filled the village chief and his wife with dread. They could not imagine the Death Knight's summoner bowing his head to anyone. However, it was hardly strange to Ainz. It was always a good idea to have a friendly attitude when negotiating with someone else. Of course, he could simply have used Charm Person to make them talk, followed by high-tier memory alteration spells, much like he had done with the sisters. However, that was a last resort, because it took far too much MP. Ainz recalled the feeling of spending MP. It felt like a strange fatigue, like he had lost something. Just altering the tens of seconds of their memories until he had put on his mask and his gauntlets had taken a considerable amount of MP.
Very well then. Let us cut to the chase and begin the negotiations.
Yes, but before that, thank you very much.
The chief bowed to Ainz, his head so low that it nearly touched the table. After that, his wife bowed as well.
Without your help, we would all be dead by now. You have our deepest thanks.
Ainz was quite surprised to receive such unreserved gratitude. When he looked back on his past life, he had never been thanked like this before. No, the sisters he rescued earlier had acted that way too. Well, he had never rescued someone before, so he thought that their reaction was only natural. That was a relic from his time as a human being, as Suzuki Satoru. Although he was somewhat embarrassed by this earnest appreciation, he certainly did not dislike it.
Please, raise your heads. Like I said earlier, I did not help you for free.
We know that, but still, we wish to thank you for rescuing us and many of the other villagers.
Then, paying me more will be good enough. Come, let us discuss it. You must have many things to do, village chief.
Nothing could be more important than spending time with our savior, but I understand.
The chief slowly raised his head, and Ainz racked his non-existent brains. His goal here was to obtain information through conversation. He still remembered the tricks he had used as an office worker. How effective would they be here? Hopefully at least half of them would be useful. After steeling himself against the possibility of failure, Ainz asked,
Let us get to the point. How much can you pay me?
Oh, we would not dare deceive our savior. I do not know how many silver and copper pieces we can gather if we do not collect them from everyone, but I believe we can muster up at least 3,000 copper pieces.
I have no idea what that means. Asking them directly was a mistake. I should have tried a different approach. Besides, I wasn't a lousy worker to begin with, and my job skills weren't pretty bad.
It sounded like a large amount, but without knowing the value of money, he could not tell if it was an appropriate sum or not. He had to avoid accepting too high or too low a sum, lest he reveal his ignorance. No, he should have been relieved that they didn't offer him 4 heads of cattle or something. Just as he was about to sink into depression, his mental state immediately settled down. Ainz silently praised his undead body, and then he realized one more thing. First, copper and silver pieces were the basic units of currency in this village. Second, there should be other forms of currency which were more or less valuable, but he was not confident that he could draw this information out of them. He needed to learn the monetary value of these copper pieces. Without that knowledge, things would be troublesome in the future. However, not knowing the value of money was quite suspicious. and he wanted to keep a low profile while he learned more about this world. That was why he was thinking as hard as he could to avoid making a bigger mistake.
These small coins are hard to carry in large amounts. I'd like something in a bigger denomination, if you can manage it.
Our sincerest apologies. If we could pay in gold pieces, we would. However, the fact is that our village does not use gold pieces.
Ainz fought back the urge to sigh in relief. The chief's answer went in the direction that he was hoping for. Therefore, Momonga thought heavily about how he would continue steering the conversation, until it seemed like smoke would start coming out of his head.
How about this? I plan to buy the produce of this village for a reasonable price, so all you need to do is pay me in currency used for trading.
Ainz secretly opened his inventory under his robe and withdrew a pair of gold coins from Yggdrasil. One of the coins was decorated by the face of a woman, while the other coin had the face of a man. The former was a coin from after the huge update, Valkyrie's Downfall, while the latter was a coin from before the update. Their values were the same, but they meant different things to Ainz. The old coin was one that had followed Ainz ever since he had started playing Yggdrasil, until he had formed the guild Ainz Ul Gon. The new coins had been released with the update, when Ainz Ul Gon had been in its golden age. His equipment was almost complete at that point, so those coins simply went into his inventory's coffers. Ever since he had started out as a skeleton mage, he used his spells to defeat monsters roaming the world, and gained gold coins which floated in the air. He soloed dungeons, defeated the vicious monsters within, and earned a huge pile of gold with great effort. After the members of Ainz Ul Gon completed a dungeon, they sold the data crystals they collected, and in exchange, they received these gold pieces, which glowed so brightly. But Ainz waved that topic aside. He put the old coin away, and held up the new coin.
If I used this gold piece to buy something, what could I get for it?
He placed the gold coin on the table. As one, the village chief and his wife stared, their eyes wide.
This is...
This is currency used in a land far, far away. Can it be used here?
I should think so. Please wait a little.
Relief came over Ainz as he heard that the coin could be used. Then, he watched as the chief left his seat, went to his room, and came back with something he had once seen during his history lessons. That object was called a balance scale. After that, it was his wife's turn. She took the gold coin and put it next to a circular object, as though she were comparing their sizes. After she was satisfied, she placed the gold coin on one pan of the balance, and on the other pan went a counterweight. He seemed to recall that this sort of thing was called a standardized mass. As Ainz went through his memories, he compared them to the wife's actions and tried to figure out what she was trying to do. The first part should have been comparing his coin to the gold pieces of this country, and next, she was trying to confirm its gold content. It would seem the gold coin was heavier, and the standardized mass rose up. The chief's wife put another mass on it, and both sides balanced out.
It seems to be about twice as heavy as a regular gold piece. Perhaps if we could scratch the surface.
Oi! You're being rude. Please accept my sincerest apologies on behalf of my wife for saying such foolish things.
No wonder. She must have thought I was gold-plated.
Ainz was not completely unoffended, but he was not angry.
It's fine. Although, if you scratch it and find it's pure gold, you'll take it, no?
Oh no, we are truly sorry for this.
The chief's wife bowed in apology and returned the gold coin.
Think nothing of it. After all, it's only sensible to verify the bona fides of any money you're given. Still, what do you think of this gold piece? Don't you think it looks like a work of art?
Indeed, it is very beautiful. May I ask the name of the country from which it came?
It's no longer... Yes, that country no longer exists.
I see.
Well, you've confirmed for yourselves that it weighs twice as much as a regular gold piece. But considering its artistic value, this gold piece should be worth more as a result. What do you think?
That may be so, but we are not merchants, and we do not know the value of art.
Well, that's not wrong. So, if I were to use this to buy something, would it be worth 2 normal gold pieces?
Of course.
Actually, I have a few more gold pieces like this. What can you sell me for them? Of course, I wish to pay the usual market rate for them. I don't mind if it's the same as what a street vendor would charge. By all means, go ahead and inspect these coins. Please.
Lord Ainz Ulgown.
The village chief's sudden shout made Ainz's non-existent heart lurch. The chief's determined expression seemed harder and more forceful than before.
Ainz will do.
Lord Ainz, then.
The chief seemed a little surprised at this, but he soon nodded and continued speaking.
I fully understand what you want to say, Lord Ainz.
For a moment, Ainz wondered if a giant question mark icon had appeared over his head. There seemed to be a misunderstanding of some sort, but he had no idea what the chief was getting at, so he did not know how to answer him.
I am very aware that you do not wish to be seen as cheap, and I understand that you would wish to request an appropriate reward in keeping with the public view of yourself, Lord Ainz. Certainly, it would require a great deal of money to obtain your services. Therefore, what else do you desire besides 3,000 coppers?
Ainz had no idea what the chief was talking about, and his mind was a whirl of confusion. He was silently grateful that he was wearing a mask. The reason Ainz brought out the gold coin was because he wanted to know what it could buy, and thus gain a rough grasp of market values. How had things ended up like this? The chief did not give Ainz any opportunity to cut in, and continued.
However, as I said earlier, this village can only produce 3,000 copper coins in cash. Although you must be suspicious of us, we would not dare hide the truth from our savior, Lord Ainz.
The chief's expression seemed honest and determined. He did not seem to be lying. If it turned out to be a deception, then Ainz could only curse his inability to read people.
No, I am certain that a great man like yourself could not possibly be content with that sum. Perhaps if everyone in the village gathered their wealth, we might be able to produce sufficient cash to satisfy you, Lord Ainz. However, our village has lost a lot of manpower, and if we paid more than 3,000 coppers, we would not be able to survive the coming winter. The same applies with our produce. Many fields will have to be abandoned because we lack the people to work them. If we gave you our supplies, our lives would be very difficult. Although it pains me to have to ask a favor of our savior, perhaps could we pay by installments?
Isn't this a good chance?
It felt like he had been lost in a dense forest, and then his field of view suddenly expanded before him. Ainz pretended to think about it. Then all he could do was pray it all worked out. After a few seconds, Ainz finally gave his reply.
I understand. The payment will not be needed.
Huh? But why?
The village chief and his wife stared at Ainz, their eyes wide and their tongues tied. Ainz raised his hand, indicating that he still had something to say. He had to consider what he could and could not reveal, and it was quite troublesome. He did not know if he could guide them into telling him what he wanted, but he had no choice but to try.
I am a magic caster. I was researching spells in a place called Nazarick, and I have only stepped outside recently.
I see. So that is why you're dressed like that.
That's right.
Ainz muttered as he touched the jealous mask. What would people on the street think if they saw a magic caster walking around in his weird getup? He thought of the crowded streets of Bali, and just as he was hoping not to see something like that in his world, Ainz noticed something that he could not understand, which was how Yggdrasil terms were understood and used here. The term magic caster referred to a lot of things. It included clerics, priests, druids, arcaners, sorcerers, wizards, bards, mikos, talismancers, sages, and countless other magic-using classes. In Yggdrasil, they were all called magic casters. It would be surprising if the exact terminology carried over to this world. Ainz watched their reaction. He replied,
I may have said that I did not want a reward, but a magic caster uses many tools to achieve his aims, including fear and knowledge. These things are all tools for generating profit, but like I said earlier, I was focused on spell research, so my knowledge of local matters is somewhat lacking. Therefore, I would like to learn about the surroundings from the two of you. In addition, I hope you will not tell anyone about this sale of information. I will accept that in lieu of a reward.
Nobody would be so nice as to say, I don't want anything. One could say that nothing was more expensive than being free of charge. Someone who saved another's life was entitled to a reward for their hard work. Yet, if the savior said they did not want a reward, anyone would find that strange. Then, the next best thing was to make the other side feel that they had paid in some way, even if it was in an intangible form. In other words, the best solution to the present situation was to allay their suspicions by having them trade information to Ainz. That would put them at ease. The chief and his wife nodded, steadfast looks on their faces.
I understand. We will not let anyone know about this.
Ainz secretly clenched his fist in approval. It would seem the skills he had picked up through working could still be put to use here.
Excellent. I do not wish to bind you with magic. I shall trust your good nature.
Ainz extended an armored hand. The chief stared blankly at it for a moment before taking the situation in, and he grasped Ainz's hand. After that, Ainz breathed a sigh of relief. It would seem shaking hands was a known practice here. It would have been tremendously depressing if the chief had looked dumbfoundedly at him. Of course, Ainz did not fully trust them. After all, mouths that were sealed by the promise of benefits could be opened by bigger benefits. If he tried to play on their personalities to keep them quiet, the vagaries of human nature might make them talk. No method was better than the other. So all Ainz could do was take a chance and hope that the chief's character would keep his lips sealed. Although, it would be fine even if he did talk. That betrayal would simply be more leverage Ainz could use in future dealings with the village. That said, Ainz's instincts told him that they would not betray him. After seeing the earnest gratitude of the chief and his wife, he believed that they would be loyal.
Then, can you tell me more about this place? What? What is this?
Is something the matter?
No, it's fine. I was simply speaking to myself. Forgive me for alarming you.
Ainz recovered in an instant and immediately covered himself up. If his body were still human, he would be sweating buckets by now. The chief simply said,
Is that so?
And did not ask further. Perhaps the chief had already equated magic casters with weirdos. Then again, that was better for Ainz.
Shall I prepare a drink for you?
Oh, no. I'm not thirsty. Please, don't trouble yourself.
His wife was no longer in the room, but outside. There were many things she had to help with. Only Ainz and the chief were in the house now. Ainz first asked about the neighboring countries, and the chief responded with many names that he had never heard before. Although Ainz was prepared for this, he could not help but be surprised after hearing them. At first, Ainz had thought that this world would be designed according to the fundamental principles of Yggdrasil. After all, he could use Yggdrasil's magic here, and there were many connections with Yggdrasil too. Yet, none of the names he heard were related to Yggdrasil. The nearby countries were the Riestes Kingdom, the Baharuth Empire, and the Slain Theocracy. These names did not appear in the context of Yggdrasil, which was inspired by Norse mythology. Ainz felt like the world was spinning, and his body was wobbling. Ainz gripped the table edge with a gauntleted hand to maintain his balance. Although he had expected this world to be an alien one, he could not help but be surprised by it. The impact was greater than he had expected. This was the first time he had felt so shaken ever since he had become undead. Ainz tried his best to remain calm and reconsider what he had heard about those neighboring kingdoms and the local geography. Firstly, there was the Riestes Kingdom and the Baharuth Empire. These countries were on different sides of a mountain range, and to the south of those mountains was a sprawling forest, and at the edge of that forest was this village, under the Riestes Kingdom and the fortress city of Irantel. Relations between the kingdom and the empire were bad, and they would fight a battle in the wilderness near Irantel almost every year. To the south was the Slain Theocracy. The best way to describe the orientation of these countries was to draw a circle and then divide it up with an inverted T. It seemed confusing, but it was much easier to describe things that way. To the left was the Riestes Kingdom, to the right was the Baharuth Empire, and below them was the Slain Theocracy. There were other countries, but the chief only knew of these three. The chief was not sure where exactly this village was placed between the three of them. In other words,
how foolish of me.
The knights from just now were wearing armor emblazoned with the insignia of the Baharuth Empire, so the chief believed that they were from the Baharuth Empire. But this area also bordered the Slain Theocracy, so they might have been knights from that country in disguise. Releasing them all was a mistake. He should have kept one for questioning, but it was too late for that now. If this was the work of the Slain Theocracy, then he should probably do something on the Empire's side. On the Kingdom's side, he should have accumulated enough goodwill with them for rescuing their village, so things should be fine for now. Ainz sank into thought. Was he the only one who had come to this world? Impossible. There was a very high chance other players had come here too. Perhaps Hirohiro was here as well. He needed to think about what would happen if he encountered other players. If other players had come to this world, they would probably gather up, given the nature of Japanese people. He could give in to anything, as long as it did not involve Ainzul Gon. The problem was what would happen if the other side considered him an obstacle. The possibility was slight, but it could not be discounted. Ainzul Gon was a guild that had always roleplayed as villains through PKing, and thus, they were a much-hated guild. He couldn't be sure that he had shed that negative image. For all he knew, the other players might want to take revenge on him out of a sense of justice and righteous anger. In order to avoid others declaring a vendetta on him, he had to refrain from doing anything that antagonized the surrounding people. For instance, massacring the local populace, especially innocent civilians, might enrage those players who had not yet lost their humanity. Of course, it would be a different matter if there was a reason which would satisfy them, such as killing the knights who were trying to sack this village. In any event, it would be better if future actions were taken for a high-sounding reason. That also meant he might have to do things he did not like, but that could not be helped. If the people he met bore hatred toward Ainzul Gon, then combat would be unavoidable. To that end, he had to draw up a plan and countermeasures if that situation took place. given the current strength of the great underground tomb of Nazarik's defenses, they could easily overwhelm about 30 level 100 players. In addition, they could use world-class items in their defense, so it was a nigh impregnable fortress. They would probably be able to repel invaders like they had in the past. However, it was easy to see how dire the situation could be without reinforcements. In addition, the trump card of Ainz Gone, their world-class items, would drain Ainz's levels every time he unleashed their full power. If they were attacked in succession, the time might come when the world-class items would become unusable. Ainz was very clear that wargaming a scenario like this in his head was prone to bias and tunnel vision. However, Ainz was no longer a child, and he always considered the worst-case scenario before taking any action. This was simply thinking of how to take care of a problem before it happened. If he just wanted to scrape by, he could simply live in the mountains like a beast. However, the power he possessed and the mighty name he bore prevented him from doing that. If he wanted to coexist peacefully with the world, then he would need to deal with problems as and when they came up. As such, combat and the expansion of fighting power would become a very important topic in the future. He had to gather information about this world, as well as news about other players.
That should do.
What happened?
No, it's nothing. I simply spaced out because things were not as I expected. Right. Can you tell me about something else now?
Yes, I understand.
The village chief started talking about monsters next. Much like Yggdrasil, this world had monsters in it. The nearby forest was filled with monsters, and one of them was known as the Wise King of the Forest. There were also dwarves, all sorts of elves, goblins, orcs, ogres, and the like. Apparently, some of the demi-humans had even built their own nation. There were people called adventurers who drove off these monsters, and they counted many magic casters among their number. Apparently, these adventurers had guilds of their own in all the big cities. Apart from that, he also learned about the nearby fortress city of Irantel. According to the chief, Irantel was the biggest city in the area, although he did not know exactly how large its population was. That seemed to be the best place to gather information. While the chief's words were helpful, there were still many unclear details. Therefore, it would be better to send someone over there to find out, rather than ask the chief questions. Finally, there was the matter of language. It was truly surprising that they understood Japanese in this new world. As a result, Ainz looked carefully at the village chief's mouth and discovered that he was not, in fact, speaking Japanese. Neither their words or the movements of their mouths matched up with the Japanese language. After that, he did some more experiments. His conclusion was that someone had fed the people of this world some sort of translation konyaku. However, he did not know who had fed that substance to them. The language of this world was translated before the other party heard it. If he could understand what the other person said, then he should be able to communicate with non-human life forms, like say a dog or a cat. The question now was who had done this. In addition, the village chief did not find this strange. It seemed perfectly natural to him. In other words, this was a basic principle of the world. Then again, when one thought about it calmly, this was a magical world, which might run on completely different precepts than the world in which Ainz had been born. It would seem that the basic knowledge and facts he had learned in his previous life were no longer applicable here. This was a grave problem. If he was ignorant about this world, there was a chance he might make a fatal mistake. ignorance was synonymous with disaster in this case. Right now, Ainz lacked information about his surroundings. He had to solve this problem quickly, but he had no idea where to begin. Could it be that he had to kidnap someone and make him talk about what he knew? That was not a very workable option. That being the case, there was only one alternative left to him.
It would seem I'll need to live in the city for a while.
He had to observe and imitate many things in order to learn about the world. He also needed to understand the magic of this world and many other things about it. As he thought about this, he heard footsteps from outside the flimsy wooden door. There was a large delay between the sounds of the footsteps, which meant that whoever it was, they were not advancing quickly. Those were the steady, plodding sounds of a grown man's footsteps. A knocking came from the door just as Ainz turned to it. The chief could not help but look at Ainz's face. He dared not act of his own accord, because he was still explaining things to his savior, as payment for saving him and everyone else in the village.
Please, by all means. I was intending to take a break myself. I won't mind if you step outside.
I'm very sorry about this,
the chief said as he nodded in apology. He headed to the door, and when he opened it, a villager appeared. He looked first to the chief, then to Ainz, and said,
Chief, I'm sorry to interrupt you when you are talking to our guests, but they're ready for the burial.
Oh.
The chief looked to Ainz, his eyes begging for his approval.
It's fine. There's no need to worry about me.
Thank you. Then tell the others that I will be there soon.
The burial ceremony was held in a nearby communal graveyard. It was surrounded by a broken-down fence, and within were several circular stone slabs inscribed with people's names. The village chief recited the verses to ease the spirits of the dead, and the words from his mouth appealed to a god that Ainz had never heard of in Yggdrasil. It was a prayer that the spirits of the dead would find peace. It appeared that there were not enough hands to bury all the bodies at once, so they chose to bury some of them first. To Ainz, burying the dead on the day they died was too hasty, but perhaps this was a normal practice for the faiths in this world. He spotted the sisters he'd saved among the other villagers, Enri Emmot and Nemu Emmot. Their parents' bodies were among those that would be buried today. As he watched the villagers from close by, he idly stroked a 30-centimeter-long wand under his robe. The wand was made of ivory and capped with gold. There were runes over the grip, and it radiated an aura of holiness. It was a wand of resurrection. It was a magic item which could return the dead to life. Of course, Ainz did not possess just one of these wands. He had enough to resurrect all the dead in the village, with room to spare. According to the village chief, this world's magic did not have the power to raise the dead. That being the case, if he used the Wand of Resurrection, he would create a miracle in this village. However, after the prayer finished, as the burial ceremony neared its end, Ainz returned the wand to his inventory. He could have brought them back to life, but he chose not to. This was not because he felt that the souls of the dead were the domain of the gods, or some other religious reason. It was simply because he felt that there were no benefits in doing so. It was not hard to tell which would be more threatening, a magic caster that could take lives, or a magic caster which could return them. In addition, the chances of the villagers keeping the secret would be very low, even if he ordered them not to talk about the resurrections. The power to conquer death was something that everyone craved. If things were different, he might have used that power to recall people to life. However, he did not have enough information on the local conditions, so it would be unwise to do so now.
They should be content with the fact that the village was saved.
Ainz muttered as he looked at the Death Knight that was standing behind him. The Death Knight was another mystery. In Yggdrasil, all summoned monsters would vanish after a certain time unless special methods were used in their summoning. He had not used any such methods to summon the Death Knight, and its summoning time was long past, but it remained here. Although he had many hypotheses for this phenomenon, he still did not know enough to come to an answer. As Ainz was thinking about this, a pair of figures turned up beside him. One was Albedo, and the other was roughly humanoid, but resembled a spider dressed in a ninja uniform. Its 8 legs were tipped with sharp blades.
An 8-edge assassin? Albedo, this is...
Ainz looked around, but it seemed like none of the villagers were paying attention here. Albedo was one thing, but bringing a monster here would make them the center of attraction, even if the burial was going on. Just then, Ainz remembered that 8-edge assassins were monsters that could go invisible.
I brought him over because he wanted to pay his respects to you, Lord Ainz.
How refreshed my soul feels when I look upon you, Lord Mo.
Enough! Are you part of the support troops?
Yes, Lord. There are 400 vassals beside myself who stand ready to assault the village at any time.
Assault? How had it ended up like this?
As Ainz pondered that problem, he began muttering to himself. Sebas had no talent for passing messages.
There's no need for an assault. The problem's already been taken care of. Who is your commander?
That would be Lady Aura and Lord Mare. Lord Demiach and Lady Shouter remain in Nazarick and Malert, while Lord Cocytus is supervising Nazarick's perimeter security.
I see. Well, too many cooks spoil the broth. Everyone but Aura and Mare are to fall back. How many of you 8-edge assassins are there?
There are 15 of us in total, my lord.
Then you can stay with Aura and Mare.
After watching the 8-edge assassin nod in acknowledgement, Ainz turned his eyes back to the burial. They were about to fill in the graves, and the 2 girls were crying non-stop.
In order to not interrupt the burial, Ainz strolled leisurely toward one of the roads leading to the village. Behind him were Albedo and the Death Knight. Though his information gathering had been interrupted by the funeral, Ainz had still managed to learn much about the region and the ways of this world. By the time he left the village chief's home, the sun was going down. It would seem his little hero act, to pay forward the kindness his old friend showed him, had taken more time than expected. Still, the time spent here had not been wasted. In particular, the more he learned about this world, the more he realized he did not know. It was enough that he was aware of his ignorance. As Ainz watched the magnificent sunset, he thought about what he needed to do. It was dangerous to move around in this world when he did not understand anything about it. Ideally, he should finish gathering information and then begin acting in this world under a false identity. Although, after saving this village, hiding his identity was impossible. Even if the knights were exterminated, their parent country would unearth the truth. Much like in the previous world where forensic science was well developed, this new world might have its own ways of finding out the truth, and they might be very efficient in doing so. Also, even if they made no investigation, as long as the villagers survived, someone would eventually follow the trail back to Ainz. To prevent a leak, he could take them all into the great underground tomb of Nazarick. However, the country that these villagers belonged to would not take that lying down, and they might even treat it as a kidnapping. Therefore, he had stated his name and let the knights flee. There were 2 reasons for that. The first reason was that news about Ainz would get around as long as he did not hole up in Nazarick. Therefore, it would be better if he controlled how the information got out. The second was because he wanted to spread the word that Ainz Ul Gon saved a village and slew the knights. In particular, he wanted to let any players from Yggdrasil hear about it. Ainz planned to take up residence in either the kingdom, the empire, or the theocracy. If there were other players in these countries, there should be some trace of them. In contrast, if Ainz used Nazarick's personnel to gather this information, it would not only be troublesome, but very risky. For instance, given Albedo's personality, giving her the wrong kind of orders would end up making him unnecessary enemies. Therefore, from an information gathering point of view, joining one of the countries was a very good idea. It would also be good to have one of them as backing in order to ensure the autonomy of Nazarick. After all, he could not take these countries lightly while he was not aware of their power. In addition, he could not lower his guard as long as he did not know who was the most powerful person in this new world. For all Ainz knew, there might be someone stronger than him among these three nations. While there were a lot of drawbacks to becoming part of one of these kingdoms, there were many advantages as well. The question was the capacity in which he would join one of these countries. He was not interested in being a slave. Neither was he interested in becoming part of a black-hearted enterprise, like the one Hirohiro was in. Therefore, he needed to make his existence known to these factions. After having a closer look at their respective situations and how they treated him, he would move toward the most ideal of the factions. These were the basics of job hopping. In that case, when should he make his move? He might end up exposing his weaknesses while he remained ignorant. Ainz shook his head as he thought about that, as though he was tired. After all, he had been ceaselessly using his mind for the past few hours, and it was overstressed.
Let's leave it at this. We've finished everything we need to do here. Albedo, let's go back.
Understood.
Albedo's reply sounded very tense. There should be no reason for her to be so on edge in a harmless place like the village. In that case, there was only one reason he could think of for Albedo to be like this. Ainz quietly asked Albedo,
"Do you hate humans?"
I detest them. Humans are weak and inferior life forms. They would look so pretty if I squashed them like bugs. Besides that girl.
Albedo's words were as sweet as honey, yet their meaning was terribly cruel. Ainz felt that they did not fit Albedo's benign, goddess-like beauty. Therefore, he said,
I see. I understand how you feel. However, I hope you can control yourself for the time being, because we have to put on a show.
Albedo nodded energetically. As Ainz looked at her, he began to feel frustrated. Her likes or dislikes would not be a problem for now. But the future was a different matter. Understanding his subordinates was an important skill he had to master. After Ainz realized this, he began looking for the village chief. It was basic manners to bid someone farewell before leaving. He found the chief almost immediately, talking to some of the villagers. He had a stern look on his face, but it did not seem normal. Indeed, he seemed to be quite wound up. What was happening now? Ainz resisted the urge to go "Cheh" and approached the chief. After all, he had saved them once. That meant that they were his responsibility.
What's wrong, village chief?
The chief's face lit up, as though he had glimpsed a golden, shiny wire of hope.
Oh, Lord Ainz, it would seem that there are some mounted people who appear to be warriors approaching us.
I see.
The chief and the other nearby citizens looked at Ainz, worried expressions on their faces. Ainz gently raised his hand as he saw this, which filled everyone with relief as he said,
Leave it to me. Gather all of the survivors into the village chief's house right now. The chief and I will remain here.
A bell rang, and the villagers gathered. The Death Knight took up a position near the chief's house, while Albedo remained behind him, awaiting orders. In order to dispel the chief's unease, Ainz cheerfully said,
Please, be at ease. I will make an exception and handle this for free.
The chief no longer trembled, and smiled bitterly instead. Perhaps he had prepared himself to take this risk. After a while, they finally sighted many mounted warriors along the road leading to the village. The horsemen slowly entered the village.
They aren't uniformly equipped, and each of them is outfitted differently. Are they not regular troops?
Ainz mused as he observed the men and their war gear. The knights from before had breastplates bearing the sigils of the Baharuth Empire, and they were heavily equipped, each in the same way. While these men were wearing armor as well, their gear varied from man to man. Some wore leather armor, and some did not have their plate armor on, exposing the chainmail underneath. Some of them wore helmets, while some went bareheaded. About the only thing they had in common was that they each showed their faces. All of them had swords of similar make, but apart from that, they also carried bows, javelins, maces, and other backup weapons. One could say that they looked like hardened veterans of the battlefield. A less polite way would be to say that they were a ragtag bunch of sellswords. The riders finally entered the square. There were around 20 of them, and while they were wary of the Death Knight, they formed up neatly before Ainz and the village chief. A man stepped forward from the rest of the force. He seemed to be the leader of the horsemen. He looked like the fiercest and most eye-catching one of his men. The leader's eyes rested briefly upon the village chief before lingering on the Death Knight, and then he turned toward Albedo. He took a long time looking at her. However, once he satisfied himself that none of them were going to move, he immediately turned his keen gaze on Ainz. Although the man looking at him seemed to be the sort who made his living by violence, Ainz remained still. A look like that could not hope to raise any ripples on the still lake of Ainz's heart. It was not because Ainz did not fear those eyes, but because of his undead body. Perhaps he was full of confidence because he could use his powers from Yggdrasil. Once satisfied, the leader spoke in a grave tone.
I am the warrior captain of the Re-Estes kingdom, Gazeff Stronof. By order of the king, I've been visiting each of the frontier villages to exterminate knights from enemy countries who have been making trouble here.
His even baritone echoed through the village square, and there was some commotion from the chief's house behind Ainz.
The kingdom's warrior captain.
Won't anyone tell me what's going on?
Ainz thought as he spoke to the chief, his voice carrying a hint of rebuke.
What sort of man is he?
According to the traders, he was a man who claimed the championship of the martial arts tournament held before the king, and now he leads the elite warriors who are loyal to the king.
Is the man before us truly so amazing?
I do not know. All I heard were stories.
Ainz looked closely, and he saw that each of the horsemen had the same emblems on their chests, which resembled what the chief had said about the kingdom's emblems. That said, he did not have enough reliable information to be sure. Gazeff looked at the chief and said,
You must be the chief of this village. Can you tell me, who is the person beside you?
Ainz interrupted the chief, who was about to answer, before nodding to Gazeff and introducing himself.
There is no need for that. Pleased to meet you, warrior captain of the kingdom. My name is Ainz Gon, and I am a magic caster. This village was attacked by knights, and so I stepped in to rescue them.
Gazeff immediately dismounted, his armor clattering loudly as he did. He bowed deeply once he was on the ground.
Thank you for saving the village. I have no words that can adequately praise your kindness.
The air seemed to tremble. The warrior captain was a man from a privileged class of society. It was quite shocking that such a man would bow and scrape before a nobody like Ainz, in this world where people were so clearly divided amongst each other. From what he had heard, the concept of human rights was almost non-existent in this country. No, in this world. A few years ago, the kingdom still sanctioned the slave trade. One could tell Gazeff's character from the way he was ready to dismount and bow to Ainz, despite their difference in status.
This man was definitely the kingdom's warrior captain.
Ainz concluded.
Please, do not stand on ceremony. In truth, I did this for payment, so no thanks is needed.
Oh, a payment. Does this mean that you're an adventurer?
That is close enough to the truth.
Oh, I see. You must be an extraordinary adventurer then. Although, forgive my ignorance, but I've not heard of your mighty name before, Master Go.
I was traveling, you see, and I just happened to pass by. I am nobody famous.
Traveling, you say? Though, I regret having wasted the time of such a great adventurer. Could you please tell me about the black guards who attacked this village?
It would be my pleasure, warrior captain. Most of the knights who have attacked this village are already dead, so they will not be able to make trouble for the time being. Shall I go on?
Already dead? Master Gon, did you strike them down?
After listening to the way Gazeff spoke, Ainz realized that this world's form of address was Western style, and not Japanese style. In other words, it went in the order of name, then surname, and not surname, then name. At last, he had solved the mystery of why the chief looked so baffled when he had asked the chief to call him Ainz. It was only expected that he would look like that when asked to address someone in such an unfamiliar way. After realizing his mistake, Ainz covered it up with his salaryman's thick skin and replied,
Well, that is not entirely accurate.
Gazeff picked up on the hint in Ainz's tone and turned his eyes toward the Death Knight. He must have smelled the faded scent of gore and death that came from it.
I have a couple of questions. May I know who that is?
He is a servant that I have created.
Gazeff murmured in approval, and then looked Ainz up and down with a keen gaze.
Then, how about that mask?
I wear it for reasons known only to a magic caster.
May I remove the mask?
Sadly, I must refuse.
Ainz said as he gestured towards the Death Knight.
It would not be good if I lost control of him.
A look of shock flashed across the face of the chief, and gasps came from the villagers hiding within the chief's house. Perhaps he had sensed the change in the air and seen the look on the chief's face, but Gazeff nodded deeply and said,
I see. Then we'd best not take it off.
Thank you.
Then,
before that, I have a request you might not like to hear. This village was recently attacked by knights of the Empire, and if you gentlemen brought your weapons in, it might trigger unpleasant memories in the villagers. May I ask you to place your weapons in a corner of the village square, to put the people at ease?
Is as you say, Master Gon. However, this sword was given to me by the king. I cannot set it down without his express permission.
Lord Ainz, we will be fine.
Is that so, village chief? Then, please forgive my unreasonable request, warrior captain.
No, I see the logic in your thinking, Master Gon. If this sword had not been personally awarded to me by the king, I would have gladly laid it aside. Then, could we sit down and discuss the details? Also, the sky is growing dark and we would like to rest in this village for the night.
I understand. Then let us return to my home together.
In the middle of the chief's reply, one of the horsemen ran into the square. He was panting heavily and had an urgent report. In a high-pitched voice, the horseman said,
Warrior Captain! We sighted a large group of people approaching. They completely surrounded the village and they're closing in.